Very good.
Cool.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's June 12th in 2020, the era of COVID, and we're all just doing the best we can to get by, and also trying to deal with racism and those things that we need to face and deal with. And still we make time to take pause and indulge in some learning. And so we love doing our webinars. I was delighted that Dave Reitman would take me up on an offer to talk about timeout. His name came up most recently in Cheryl McNeil's webinar on a cooperation chart that she was offering up to the community. And she highlighted an article that Dave wrote with some passion a good number of years ago. But as he and I talked about, timeout is the controversy that just won't quit. It's like that annoying controversy. It just won't go away. You swat at it and it's still there. And I only have to deal with it about 5 times a day. So it's a definite part of my work life. David is a professor down at Nova Southeastern in Florida. And I like to let my presenters do their own short, quick introductions and save the bulk of the time for the presentation. We will have a hard stop at 1:45, and then we'll do a Q&A. So in the chat room, not the Q&A box, the chat room, please enter your questions. I'll be kind of curating them as we go along. So without any further ado, David, thanks for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
Okay, well, I'm not going to bore you with the minutia of my career. We're just going to get right into it. I will say that over the course of my training, I've had the pleasure of being trained by folks like Alan Gross, Ron Drabman, a bunch of child psychologists that I think gave me a really good grounding in clinical psychology, but also a lot of respect for the research literature, and also I think good clinical sound clinical practice. So I'd like to think I have a clinic at Nova Southeastern University called the ADHD Assessment, Consultation, and Treatment Program that works with children with disruptive behavior disorders. We also do psychoeducational assessments, and we do interventions. So I'd like to think that I'm practicing, what I preach, or at least my students are. And, I hope if any of you, are interested in, getting involved. I mean, if Steve wants to throw you up on the screen, I don't care. We're here to have a conversation. I'm going to put a few ideas out here. And, today we're going to focus things on timeout. But I think one of the messages I'm going to have for you is that, I think the controversy about timeout is part of a broader controversy about child behavior therapy in general. So I gave a version of this at APA about 5 years ago now, and had a chance I was presenting with Bob Larzer-Lear and Anio Cipriani as well. And I believe also Mark Roberts was involved in that as well. So, this topic is not gotten stale. It just seems to keep on going. So timeout, the controversy that just won't quit. So I think when you look at what people know or what they think they know about behavior analysis, there's a lot of misinformation. When I first started I actually started in the Association of Behavior Analysis before I got involved in the Association for Behavior and Cognitive Therapy, ABCT. And those are the two major professional organizations for behavioral psychologists. When I got involved in ABA in 1992, I joined a special interest group called Balance. And we conceived of this as a sort of anti-defamation league. If any of you are Jewish, you'll know what that is, for behavior analysis, because we feel that people were, had disparaged it, had twisted, and really misrepresented what behavior analysis is about. It was an important thing then. I'm not sure we succeeded. In fact, I'm certain we did not succeed. We failed miserably, but we did try, and I'm still trying, as are a lot of other folks. So the thing we have to be careful about is the straw man version of behavior analysis that's put out there. So, straw man is an informal fallacy based on misrepresentation of an opponent's position. To attack a straw man is to create the illusion of having refuted the proposition by substituting a superficially similar yet weaker proposition and refuting it without ever having to refute the original position, right? And to me, that in a nutshell sort of characterizes perfectly what's happened to child behavior therapy. The first direct sort of encounter I had with a really egregious form of misrepresentation was thanks to Alfie Kahn, and this is what Cheryl a couple of weeks ago was referencing, the paper that I wrote. And this really simply happened as I was walking down the hallway at LSU, and I encountered a student that had this book in their hands, and LSU is a primarily behavioral program, and I said, WTF, what is that? And I think one of the professors, possibly a cognitive psychologist, had exposed them to this. And, expose, I really do mean that in a sort of infectious disease kind of way. This kind of thinking is problematic, and as I'll point out later, I think destructive. So Alfie's book took quite a few liberties with behavior analysis, but it's not completely without any redeeming qualities. There are two excellent interviews, if you can believe it, with B.F. Skinner himself in the appendix. So it's certainly worth reading for those reasons, but don't buy it. Just read my review. I've cited plenty of the passages, enough to give you a very good handle on the nature of the misrepresentations. But, however, if you do happen to read it or take it out of the library.
Okay.
All right, cool. Well, sorry about that, folks. We're just getting rolling, and look what happened to us. Okay. So in No Drama Discipline, they really echo a lot of the same sorts of criticisms as you find in Punished by Rewards. They promise the same sorts of panaceas for the apparent ills of the behavioral approach. Alfie Kahn had a charming term. He called it pop behaviorism, which I thought was a nice turn of phrase. And what I found in reading No Drama Discipline was very similar to what I found in Punished by Rewards in a number of different ways. Number one, they regard what we do as being based primarily on work with animals. So in effect, it's irrelevant, right? We characterize children as passive agents to be manipulated. So it's also unethical. We're concerned with fostering compliance only, and we don't teach. Now, that's a criticism that potentially might have some legs, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. That we seek to manipulate behavior without concern for causes. Again, if you're a behavior analyst, you find this particularly annoying. But if you come from the behavioral stream that is not particularly closely aligned with applied behavior analysis, or as it's sometimes charmingly called, radical behaviorism, then you might actually somewhat agree with that, right? So again, I don't, but many people on the outside and even some people on the inside might actually see some room for critique there. And then the last but not least, that we do not provide for the protection and welfare of children. That in some way, the aims of of child behavior therapists and perhaps teachers are sort of aligned children in some way. So they're for children and we are against them. Right? So what's the essence? If you want to get right to, I believe you should actually quote people directly rather than paraphrasing them. So what does he actually say? He says the basic strategy for raising children, teaching students, and managing workers can be summarized in 6 words. Do this and you'll get that. It's ineffective, right? What's he say about that? Rewards and punishments are 2 sides of the same coin, and that coin doesn't buy much. right? Promising goodies to children can never produce anything more than temporary obedience. And that's a big deal. They come back to that a lot, this sort of short-term focus on compliance, whereas they're interested in the big picture. Again, I think that's a critique that might actually have some validity to it. Right? So again, what do they say? No drama discipline, right? This is the whole brain way. The rationale for this is a little different than in public punish by rewards. Right? Alfie Kahn takes a more kind of ethical, practical sort of argument. He brings that to the fore. No drama discipline takes the same argument, but then backs it with the real science, right? Neuroscience. So this is a harder giant to slay, I think, right? If you want to counter the criticism, right? So no drama discipline says that we are promoting a one size fits all kind of discipline, right? And we respond to this misbehavior, when we respond to it right away, we're not taking into account the true sophistication of the problem, right? Again, it's a version of that simplistic argument, right? One size fits all. So what do they say? One of the most self-defeating parenting recommendations we hear from time to time goes something like this. When a child misbehaves, it's important that you address the behavior right away. Otherwise, they won't understand why they're being disciplined, right? And of course, we do argue that immediate punishment and immediate reinforcement has a stronger, more reliable impact than delayed reinforcement and delayed punishment. Okay, so again, accurate, but disingenuous, I think, and misleading. So then they come in with the zinger. This is good stuff. We actually don't think this is bad advice if you're running a behavioral conditioning lab with animals. Again, they bring in the it's irrelevant piece. For mice or even dogs, it's good advice. But human beings, not so much. Ooh, ouch, that hurts, right? So no drama discipline response. This is on ignoring tantrums. They're giving us the other way, right? A no drama discipline response to a tantrum begins with parental empathy, right? When we understand why children have tantrums, their young developing brains are subject to becoming disintegrated as their big emotions take over, then we're going to offer a much more compassionate response when the screaming, yelling, and kicking begins, right? So they aren't us, right? They're not going one size fits all. They're coming with the good stuff. They're coming with empathy. And I guess by contrast, we are not, right? Other stuff, right? Problems with timeout in our one size fits all approach. As you'll see in the coming pages, there are dozens of other more nurturing, relationship building, and effective ways to respond to kids than to automatically give them a timeout as a one-size-fits-all default consequence for any misbehavior. The same goes for spanking and even for consequences in general. That's a version of the Alfie Kahn argument that that praising and rewarding children is nearly, if not maybe worse, than punishing them, right? So Alfie really expands the critique, right, to consequences, contingency in general, which is, for us, I think, pretty difficult to take, right? So they say, fortunately, as we soon explain, there are better alternatives than to spank, give a timeout, or automatically take away a toy or privilege. Alternatives that are logically and naturally linked to the child's behavior. They build the brain and they maintain a strong connection between the parent and the child. And that would be awesome. All of that would be terrific if they actually had any data to support it, but they don't, right? But again, back to the persuasiveness and the methods that they use to disparage our approach. And here is one of the authors of No Drama Discipline for your consideration.
It's loading up there.
Yep. Loading kind of slow, but it's coming.
It's coming.
We promise.
Let's hope it's worth waiting for.
Timeouts are not something I'm a big fan of. They don't tend to be very effective, and here's why. Timeouts are supposed to be a moment when a child, you stop their behavior and you ask them to reflect on what's happening. What 2 or 3 or 4 or 5-year-old sits and reflects on their own behavior in timeout? None that I know. They actually reflect on how mean you are for putting them there. So it really is perceived as a punishment.
Boy,
even if
that makes us sound pretty ridiculous, doesn't it? Except it's not true. and we don't. If you know timeout and you explained it properly to parents, there's no expectation that the child reflect or have an epiphany while they're in timeout. We're simply communicating to them, in my view, that this behavior isn't acceptable and it needs to stop. That's it, right? If they want to reflect or write a treatise on the rightness or wrongness of their behavior while they're in timeout, well, they won't have a pencil, so they can't do that. But if they want to write it up here, they're free to do that. But that's not a requirement, right? But of course, they make us look ridiculous by suggesting that we expect this, or this is a critical part of the procedure, when it is not in any way, shape, or form, right? So let's see what else she has to say.
you intend for it to be kind of a time of quiet. Additionally, I'd rather my child do something more active or proactive and get practice doing things the right way. So instead of saying, you have a timeout because you were too rough with, petting the dog, I might say instead, come over and let's pet the dog gently together and show them and give them practice doing things the right way. Additionally, timeouts often
So the key thing there is that what we're proposing, right, when we defend timeout and make ourselves sort of a one-trick pony, it's real easy to critique what we're doing, because we wouldn't defend the use of timeout as a standalone procedure. In fact, there's research on that very thing, and it shows that timeout is much, much more effective in the context of a broader behavior management program. All of our responses, publicly and otherwise, clearly indicate that timeout isn't to be used in the way that she's describing it. But again, it's a straw man argument or a straw person argument.
Because the child is having a hard time. They're kind of falling apart. They're not able to make good choices in the moment. And usually these are times when kids most need connection from us. So just like when they were little infants and they were needing us to comfort them and kind of regulate their nervous systems and calm them down, in moments when they're out of control and not acting in the ways that they know they're supposed to, this is often a time they need to connect with us and be comforted by us, as opposed to us putting them in timeout and isolating them. When I ask myself the question, what is the lesson I want my child to learn when I'm disciplining him? Discipline is all about teaching. So when I ask, what is the lesson I want them to learn and what's the most effective way to teach it? Timeout never seems to be the answer to that question for me. I just think there are much more effective ways to discipline our children that allow us to connect with them and give them practice doing things the right way.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't disagree with her, right? And more than likely, neither do you. So that is a real challenging aspect of this for me. Let me get out of here now. Okay, so we're back. So that really represents a very clever, it's a great way to sell books. And let's remember, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to sell books. And to sell a book, you need a boogeyman. You need a foil, right? Politically, people know this. You run against somebody else, not necessarily on your own merits. And that's clearly what's happening here, right? So to summarize, Punish by Rewards and No Drama Discipline sort of accomplish what they do by basing what they're doing in science. Now, they go to different literatures, right? For Punish by Rewards, it's the intrinsic motivation, social psychology literature. And for No Drama Discipline, it's interpersonal neurobiology and neuroscience. But ironically, in my view, the appeal is not really to science, right? Because you can see on YouTube, she's not citing the literature. She's talking about how you feel and what you want to do and what your expectations for your children are, and how it clearly can't be about making them feel bad or shaming them, right? Which presumably is what we're in support of, right? The other thing that's in these things is they really are written for the lay public, right? They use catchphrases, pop behaviorism, do this and you'll get that. No Drama Discipline made a lot of noise about claiming that when children are in timeout, that their brains look like they're experiencing physical abuse. And this is based on real science and brain scans and things of that nature. And then again, potentially true. Your brain probably does look pretty scattered and perhaps vaguely reminiscent of the activity of a person who's being physically abused. But again, that's a heck of an extrapolation to draw, right? That these are somehow equivalent, but it makes for an effective argument, right? And then the worst thing is, as we saw before, those kinds of misrepresentations can now be widely shared and read thanks to the internet in a way that they couldn't possibly have been in the past. So any misinformation that's spread now can be recorded, shared, and multiplied hundreds, if not thousands, of times. So sorry about how long these take to load.
Okay, so I wrote a book called No Drama Discipline with Dr. Dan Siegel, and it has been such a blast to talk about this book out in the world to parents and educators and mental health people and camps and all kinds of audiences. And here's the basic bottom line. Here's sort of my to the core what the book is about, and that is this: that when I say discipline, most people think the word that they associate with that is punishment or consequences. But discipline is teaching. It's skill building. And so when we actually think about discipline moments as moments to teach and build skills, then we can think about it like this: that if we are effective disciplinarians, and by disciplinarian, of course, I mean teacher and skill builder, then we're going to be disciplining less over time, because as we teach and build skills, our children begin to do that for themselves. They become.
Now, she's not consistent in how she's talking about discipline here, right? That discipline for most people is a euphemism for punishment, right? But she presents a very interesting idea, and one that I've been presenting for years, about disciples, right? Students, right? Jesus had disciples. They followed him because of love, not because of fear, right? That's the message of the New Testament, right? You are welcomed into God's kingdom when you accept the way of the Lord and you follow that, right? There's no strong admonitions about, punishment, and all the hellfire stuff came later. That wasn't Jesus, right? So No Drama Discipline, actually in their presentation, what they do is they co-opt something that we are about, right? Teaching, right? There are many, many examples, I'll show some later, of how behavior therapy and learning theory has always been attached to teaching. Right? It's insane that we would allow ourselves to be pigeonholed as the people that were against teaching, or somehow against love and praise and skill building, right? So we can't allow this kind of thing to happen, right? So both of these books present straw man arguments that characterize our approaches as simplistic, rigid, one size fits all, and generally harmful, right? And it doesn't end there, right? Those are two very popular books, I suppose. And I didn't know this, but Cheryl actually, enlightened me as to the presence of Alfie Kahn on Oprah, of all things. Now, talk about, impact. If you've reached Oprah, you've reached maximum velocity there, right? So here's a little element, a blurb from a blog.
Steve Kurtz's webinars. You're telling me it's Oprah?
Hey, Steve, you are a start. You are from what I'm told, you are a launching point to Oprah.
So on receiving. All right.
I'm waiting for the call. So to the degree that timeouts are seen by punishments as kids, and they always are, right, according to the good doctor here, they are not as effective as positive guidance to encourage good behavior. And if you're using timeouts to deal with your child's meltdowns, that's actually destructive, because you're triggering your child's abandonment panic, right? Wow, that's some heavy stuff, right? So she has some alternatives to timeout. Let's hear what they're about. Dr. Laura Markham.
When our child is doing something we don't want, most of us search for a consequence, some sort of penalty to force the child to do things the way we want. Actually, if we back up and we start by staying connected, emotion coaching, so our child can regulate their emotions and therefore their behavior, our child will want to behave because they're connected, and they'll have the emotional tools to behave, and you won't need consequences because you'll see very little misbehavior. And when you do see misbehavior, you can help your child with whatever emotions drove it, and then sit down and help your child understand how to repair it. I think your brother was pretty upset when you knocked down his tower. Wonder what we could do to help him feel better. All of us inadvertently damage relationships from time to time. Very important for children to know how to do that repair work. It works so much better than a consequence to get your child to do what you want. They just resent that. But this is repair work. You're empowering your child to make something better and to know we all make mistakes, but we can always make it better.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there. That's for sure. Let me make sure. Yeah, I got to make sure that stops. Okay, cool. So, throughout a lot of the more contemporary arguments against presumably the straw person that they're presenting is that this approach, our approach, does not deal with emotions, right? And there's a lot of primacy and agency given to emotions. Skinner would have called that an explanatory fiction. And I don't want to get into that argument here, but I think that's a problem. It's a real problem, both within our scientific community and also within the public discussion about the usefulness of timeout and child behavior therapy more, generally. If you want to, you can go to the link down here concerned with AHA parenting. You'll see there's a lot of, there's much there that has some value. And I don't want to make it sound as if the things that are being said in these books and on these web pages have no value whatsoever. In fact, a recent meta-analysis suggested that a lot of the information that's out there is actually reasonably consistent with the scientific literature, but it's in the spots where it's not, and in particular with respect to punishment procedures that I think we need to be most thoughtful, and we need to give that consideration. So how do you respond to a straw man attack? The best way to respond to it is not to validate it, right? And if you get defensive and try to argue, as I believe Division 53 did, that timeout is effective, then I think you fall into the trap of making it seem as if what we do is timeout. That's our thing. Punishment is our thing. It's a small part of our thing, right? And it's perhaps a critical part for some children, but we have real issues if we allow ourselves to be painted into the corner of being the timeout people. And I think successfully in the mind of some people, that's what's happened. We've been painted that way. Bill Belichick, he's smarter than that. He doesn't entertain those questions. He just says, next question, right? In fact, it even became a meme, next question. So in my view, it's best to either totally ignore it, next question, or I don't think we can afford that, frankly, because the damage has already been done. We need to clarify what we're about in very stringent, strident terms, right? So I've already kind of alluded to this, so I'll move through this rather quickly. Have we inadvertently portrayed empirically based treatments as one size fits all? Have we abandoned sort of functional assessment and the flexibility that gives us in trying to understand and respond and even, God forbid, prevent child behavior problems? Yes, I think we have, right? Our own success has victimized us, right? That people embrace behavior management training and the various forms of Hanf model behavior management training is a wonderful and tremendous thing, and it's done tremendous good. So Sidman says the following: the withdrawal of positive reinforcement is just as coercive as the application of shock, but because timeout inflicts no pain, it's often justified as a benign form of punishment. So he's no fan, here, right? And he says the cruelty lies less in the method than in the outcome. Isolation, physical restraint, and chemical restraint remove the victims from contact with all the reinforcers that make life meaningful and worthwhile. So here's a behavior analyst, long time, well-known, extremely well respected, and sure enough, he's coming out against timeout, right? And he's one of us, presumably, right? What is his alternative, however? And this is illuminating. His alternative.
My goodness. So APA has a response to no drama disciplines way of presenting what we do, right? And the article is on time.com. It says timeouts are hurting your child, and they describe timeout as ineffective, and they also describe it as okay. We're back?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, Steve. So they describe it as ineffective and hurting your child, right? They suggest as an alternative to timeout, and they're consistent about this, and I believe they should be and can be criticized for suggesting that while the child is in distress, presumably following misbehavior, that you use that moment to forge a loving relationship with the child, right? I think most of us would look at that and say, hey, the probability that you're going to reinforce inappropriate behavior is pretty high if you do that, right? And we actually need some studies, I think, to actually document that is a decidedly bad thing to do, although you might have a problem getting it past an IRB because I think even they could probably see that might happen. So their recommendation of time in as an alternative is somewhat ridiculous. But I think the other things that they're suggesting are actually not ridiculous. And we run a real risk in a sort of marketing standpoint if we come out against those things, right? We run the risk of, in critiquing them and not presenting what we do, we run the risk of coming out against loving relationships, against talking with your child, against comforting them. and that we have to be extremely careful about that. And in other respects, the APA response, the Division 53 response was fine. They talked about research supporting it, but that's not a unique response, right? So I don't know if I have enough time to I'm just going to show a minute or so of a really terrific presentation by Charlie Cunningham at one of the Division 53 events, the Niagara Conference down here in Miami. And you'll see, we can make the case that timeout works all day long. So here's Charles doing
as John showed earlier. And this is who may drop out early in the process, may in fact, for fathers versus mothers. Dads often feel that, well, I don't need this. This is not something, I don't have as much my sympathies for that parent who was trying to execute that core ingredient in a lot of parenting programs, but not all. So this analysis looking at programs that did not include timeout versus those that did. So timeout seems to be a critical part of a good parenting program. And so if you think about it, in Cunningham's original program, the first half of the program was called Child's Game. It was a relationship building part. The second half was called Parents' Game, and that focused on encouraging compliance and encouraging cooperation, and if necessary, using time up as a backup strategy. And these analyses would suggest that both the relationship building and the control strategies that are introduced in parenting programs are critical to their success.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? Timeout works, and we have evidence, we can prove it. There are also some excellent reviews. In recent years, like the past couple of years, a lot of stuff has come out
This is a nice review, an update of a previous paper by Forehand, looking at parameters of timeout and, you know, the things that we have support for, things that we don't have support for. I don't have time to go into the details, unfortunately, but the last point here at the bottom is an interesting one, right? And that is that we have, oh, sorry, let me go back a little bit. A disconnect between research findings and parent beliefs about timeout, right? And we are responsible for that. We need to do a better job of communicating what are the effective elements and parts of timeout and what things are not. Here's a terrific very recent review, actually just came out by Bob Larzalier, refuting the notion that, you know, what he calls exclusively positive parenting, you know, programs are going to be effective, and or perhaps put a little differently, that we can justify throwing time out, you know, to the scrap heap because we have a better mousetrap. Larzalier and I think certainly feel that is way premature. However, if we do a few things better, we can certainly reduce beyond where we are right now the amount of punishment that is done. So here's what timeout sounded like with my son about 5 years ago.
Daddy, can you tell me how many seconds there is until I'm done with timeout? Daddy? Can you tell me how many seconds there is until I'm done?
Now I'm ignoring him while I'm in the room, but I'm not paying any attention to him. I'm not looking at him. I'm doing it textbook.
Can you tell me how many seconds there is until I'm done? Daddy, can you tell me how many? Daddy, I would like some attention. Daddy, can you listen to me? Daddy, can you listen to me? Daddy, I would like some attention. Daddy.
He doesn't like it.
Daddy. Daddy. Daddy.
Now, it goes on for a while. It's only a few minutes long, and I may terminate it. But, you know, up ahead here, you're going to hear an extinction burst.
Daddy. 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 Daddy.
I'll wait for the extinction burst.
Daddy, I mean it.
Oh, I mean, I'm serious now.
Daddy. 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 Daddy.
See, he's getting louder.
Daddy, daddy, daddy.
There it
daddy,
is.
Daddy.
There it is. Daddy, 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 daddy.
Daddy. Daddy.
So you get the idea, right? I mean, he doesn't like it in there. He wants my attention. He's not in distress, right? He's not damaged. He's still the same cute kid that he always, you know, was, but he's got the message, right? That behavior you went into timeout for is not acceptable, right? So here's a more. Okay, so Steve, you can throw it up to some questions.
Awesome. The first question comes from Cheryl McNeil, and Cheryl's saying, what's your short answer to the foster parent who says, I'm worried about a timeout procedure re-traumatizing my child?
Well, you know, like the evidence, right, for that is non-existent, right? That there have been some excellent reviews of that. I was reading one, last night, and it simply doesn't appear. However, if you're a good therapist, I would imagine your response would be, tell me about what your concerns are, right? And if you need to modify a timeout procedure so that you're, you know, in a way that would not make it ineffective, that would be fine. And frankly, if you need to re-engineer the environment in such a way that you need to do fewer timeouts, that would be a good thing too. I'm fine with working with a parent to allay their fears. I simply want to solve their problem. Timeout is one way that you could use to do that. But again, I think if you get set up in a, you know, pitch battle to defend timeout at all costs, I think you undercut the broader message that, you know, that we are people who are interested in learning, teaching, prevention of problems, as opposed to people that are constantly reactive. You know, like I like to think of myself and as being proactive, right? And that I'm helping. I hope I'm helping parents to be more proactive in their discipline, right? So I don't think we necessarily need to defend it. If they don't want to use timeout, then, you know, we can explore trying to do it without it, you know? So I don't know if that was a short answer, but.
Short. Let me have you take the presentation off, and then I want to do something a little spontaneous here.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share, right? Oh, that's what you want?
So, yeah. So okay. I have an unusual situation, which is because we're going over, I actually have a 1:30 appointment to get fingerprinted because I'm trying to be available to a family in another jurisdiction. And so I'm going to have to pop off in a few minutes, but what I'd like to do is bring in some friends who are thoughtful senior people in this. Tom, I hope you're okay being called on without even being asked in advance. And I'll bring in, hopefully he's okay with that. We'll find out.
Awesome.
And I'll bring in Robin Gurwitch, who's a PCIT master trainer, also heavily involved in the trauma world, to expand our discussion a little bit.
Oh, we need to get an Ollendick visual though.
He may be working on it.
Come on, boy.
I'm terribly sorry I'm away from my camera, but I am.
Oh, okay, yeah, I hear you. That's a lame, that's a somewhat suspect excuse, but that's okay.
So just by way of introduction.
I know what you look like.
Just by way of super short introductions, Tom is a senior psychologist, has developed many protocols, heavily involved for decades in empirically supported approaches for our kids. Robin's a PCIT master trainer, also heavily involved in trauma work. And I'm going to go get fingerprinted so I can get licensed in Ohio. David, thank you so much. I'm going to end my part just offering this question from Megan Munson. I have a colleague who's working with some diehard con followers and trying to bring them the real world. She's a mentor, absolutely brilliant, but a lot of resistance. So on that note, I'm going to beg off, and at 1:20, you guys should just disappear. But I got to go get fingerprinted. I apologize. Thanks all.
Sorry about the technical issues. Of course, on the one day I'm doing this, you know, they're all going to, you know, all the.
There's a guy named Murphy who registered for the webinar.
He must have been on. Sorry about that.
Well, David, Tom here.
Hey, Tom.
I was struck as you were talking that some people have recently suggested it's time for timeout to be in timeout. Now, that's kind of a catchy phrase, it seems to me.
Yes.
But the issue, I think, was really one around how does timeout take into consideration the characteristics of the children on whom it's being used, and whether or not the children really have the necessary skills to do the behaviors that are being requested through the behavioral program. So it's really looking at it in a more fine-tooth sort of way. Not to throw it out necessarily, I was joking about that. We'd have to put it in timeout. But again, how it is used is sometimes not used appropriately or judiciously.
Yeah,
Comments?
well, we don't really have a formal, mechanism for establishing that a kid is suitable or, not suitable for timeout, do we? Which is kind of funny because most, medical procedures and things, have people for whom, the procedure is contraindicated. And, maybe we need to adopt, more of that, sort of, mentality, right? I think we probably haven't because, by and large, the downside risk in practical terms of doing timeout just hasn't been, established. I mean, for all of the claims that No Drama Discipline and Alfie Kohn make, I mean, they make some pretty interesting claims about, for example, using rewards, that children will become greedy, that they will become unmotivated to do things. I mean, all those things are, out there. And if you set up an experiment exactly right, you can somewhat produce some of those negative effects. But until you actually, none of their science is actually clinical science that's taking place with actual consumers of our product. So I don't know that that we can sort of address a problem that doesn't exist. So, but I know they see it as a problem. So, is it incumbent upon us to produce evidence of no problem? It's an interesting question.
I have totally been riveted by your presentation, David. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Robin. I've never met you, but I have heard of you, and you're very famous. And I don't mean, I'm not going to make a snarky, infamous comment. I mean, you are
I'll hire
well
you as my publicist.
You're well known and well respected.
Well, thank you. I will say through a trauma lens, I have learned very well that trying to argue with someone is like, and I apologize for getting political, it's trying to argue with someone who is on one side of the fence to jump over to the other side. It doesn't matter how much data I have, it's not going to matter.
I agree with you.
I have truly developed a new approach to families that I see where there's a lot of trauma of a yes and. So I'm worried that my child will be re-traumatized. Yes, you're very worried about the safety of your child and making sure that they feel comfortable. And I'm with you 100%. That's why when we think about doing our timeout with you and your family, we want to make sure it's predictable. We want to make sure it's consistent. And we want to make sure they understand that this is safe and discipline doesn't have to hurt. So we are actually going to make sure by doing all that, that your child never worries.
Yeah. And if you have, I'm sure you read that the Dads and Tully, article was very, very well written, and they really did, I think, a service to all of us, people that are working with people who are traumatized, that says, you can explain this in a way that shows that this procedure can be done with compassion and care and with the right kind of value system in place.
And I think, David, to get to your point that you made about the emotions, that's where many of our foster parents are coming from, or that others are coming from. And I could quote them science all day long, and it's great in our world, but they don't want to hear it. And if I go there, I've lost them. So the yes and addressing their concerns about re-traumatizing, whatever that means, about safety, about predictability, and actually helping to build the things that they came in wanting. So if we can tie it back to their goals, and I'm coming from a PCIT lens, that's going to be so much more beneficial. So even as Megan was saying, I would go with the yes and too. Yes, and there's so many things that they do talk about in their work around building the relationship. And that's why PCIT is so critical, and we spend so much time on CDI. And we're going to make sure that we come up with a plan with you to make sure discipline can work effectively. So is it going to change everybody? No. I wish I could figure out how to make that happen, but it doesn't. So I think we need to join them where they are. And as David said, a lot of our families are coming at it from a truly emotional end. I've heard Cheryl talk about, what is trauma? Again, I'm not going to go through with many families about trauma is a fear of death. Life loss, so many other things. Sitting in a chair for 3 minutes and 5 seconds of quiet hardly qualifies as that. But I think it is something that we need to join with our families around where they are. David, my daughter, the first time I had to put her in timeout, she was about 4. At the end, she walked up to me and she said, "Do you just sit around and think of ways to make my life miserable?" And it was everything I could do, not just say, yes, I'd sit up at night and think of that. But I don't think I traumatized her. She seems to be a fairly successful young woman now, so that's a good thing. So I hope that answered questions. Other questions that are out there?
Robin, I really like your comments, and David too, of course. And I think just being cautious when one is implementing it. I remember, by the way, the first time I used it with one of my daughters, she said, "Dad, it's time for you to go to your room." And so she was right on top of it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that I think really we would advance the literature tremendously if we could find out for whom timeout works, or for whom X works, or Y works, or Z works.
Tom, I'm right with you, Tom. I want to do that study so bad, where you look at the impact of timeout on parents. That's huge. Like, why is no? I mean, if maybe somebody has done it and I haven't read it, but I've never seen a study where they actually looked at what the impact was on the parent themselves, because we all know, right, and it's implied in the procedure sometimes that giving a parent a few minutes to reflect on what's going on is one of the biggest and most important things I think that happens during timeout. So I couldn't agree with you more.
I think when we, the issue around problem solving with children, again, I really think we need to consider the age. So many parents are like, they have to say they're sorry. Well, you can get a 4-year-old to say, "I'm sorry," every single time. It means nothing and it changes no behavior. So we have to take a developmental lens through this. Mari, hi. When we think about emotion labeling and validation in PCIT, I will give you a preview of a study that we've got going on right now. So I'm super excited about it, with Christy Warner-Metzger and some therapists from Australia, looking at a trauma-directed interaction module that will fit between CDI and PDI. And the data we're finding from it, which includes some emotion identification, is that not only does the child's trauma symptoms like wipe out, the parent trauma symptoms, which we collect as well, are really dissipating. And children are using those skills across the board. And when they move into PDI, it's wonderful. But one of the things we're really helping parents understand is the difference between trauma triggers and just flat out temper tantrums because they didn't get their way. And so I think there is a place for that psychoed that even in standard PCIT during the teach, if you know that there's a trauma history, to talk about that. All children get upset. That doesn't necessarily mean they're experiencing trauma.
Yeah.
But that study will be done very soon. It's a randomized trial, so I'm super excited. I think, David,
I was
you
going to say, I
go
think
ahead,
one
Tom.
had a question about collaborative proactive solution. Is that Dina Hirschfeld, I presume?
It is.
Good. Yeah, I don't know, very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, but we have completed 2 RCTs now comparing PMT with the use of timeout to collaborative proactive solutions with Ross Green, who's the developer of that particular approach. And they do come out being comparable. And we have tried to discover for whom each works. And we have one paper that literally just came out, I just was notified about today, in Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, in which we show that different parent characteristics do interact with PMT and CPS, suggesting there might be different strategies for different strokes for different folks, right? And I think that too is just an important point to keep in mind. I won't belabor that, but just to be mindful that there might be different approaches for different families.
Yeah, I mean, it stands to reason, right? You can't ultimately, even if you put somebody in a clinical trial, you can't force them to implement it with fidelity. So you could try, and it's going to be challenging. And of course, you can always model after the fact the degree of fidelity, but it's a poor substitute for really understanding what the impact of adding, subtracting. I think what I've learned from reading all these meta-analyses, and like I said, there's some really good ones that have been produced recently, is that you can get a pretty nice bump from doing all positive things. And in fact, with maybe the vast majority, there's something I call like the audience problem. When we talk to quote unquote parents, right? The vast majority of parents, 80%, 75%, will never see a psychologist, right? Or even think about it. They'll have problems, of course, and when we're talking to that group of people, I think we can really promote all of the positive teaching, learning, relationship building stuff. Not that we wouldn't do it with people who had kids who were really challenging, but I just have always felt, and I think the research bears it out, that the parents that have kids who are extremely challenging need to have something else, and without it, they're a ship without a keel. That they need backup. And we have a humane, very well-researched, effective approach to dealing with seriously challenging behavior that we shouldn't allow people who are anti-aversive, right, to legislate out of existence. It's just insane. And frankly, that is unethical, right? And I think that's where Lars Lear and some of the other people are coming from. Like, hey, you know what? A single spank, one time, well placed in a person's life is not going to ruin them, right? That parent should not be considered a criminal for having done that, right? Now, is it an ideal approach from where I am in my office in Manhattan or my home in Fort Lauderdale? Probably not. But when I was in Louisiana and I spoke to my 300 introductory psychology students and said, how many of you were spanked? Now, these are college kids, arguably successful kids. You know how many hands went up? 80%.
Louisiana, almost all.
80%
I know we're at the very top where Steve said everybody's going to get bumped off. So I want to be mindful of that, just to let everyone know that David's presentation has references in that in case people didn't see. I think this is a conversation that would warrant multiple webinars. So we'll have to get back to Steve. Tom, I'm looking forward to reading your new article.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that. And on behalf of Steve, thank everybody for coming. David, I felt your pain with the freezing. It happened to me last week. So everybody stay safe, stay well, stay connected, and we'll see you at Steve's next gathering. Bye, guys.
Thanks for your help, Robin.
Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to see you, man. Nice to hear you. Later, man.
Good, and good to see you.
I know. It's crazy, man. Well, I'll be doing my homework. You've got me something. Definitely have me something to read. It's amazing how much stuff's been coming out lately.
It really is, and these are topics that have been around for a while, aren't they?
Yeah.
I need to run too, guys, but take good care.
Bye.
All right, man.
Good to see everyone.
Robin, once again, thanks so much.